Our first panel is really focused on the AI question that our opening speakers touched on. And I would like to invite Katie Gray of In-Q-Tel to the stage, Bob Martin of MITRE, Trey Ford from BugCrowd, and Jay Gazle from CISA. And so if you all could come up, we'll get started in just a moment. Bob, appreciate it. Thank you. They do have temp cards, but we should have them on both sides.
Oh, we have assigned seats.
We do, which is it's sort of like the wonderful. And thank you all for being here. And Anand, if you can come back to the stage, we will need you to moderate this this session. So while we are waiting for Anand, let me do just the brief introduction. I called up, but our current speakers, Ms. Gray is senior partner and Silicon Valley lead for the cyber investment team at In-Q-Tel, obviously focused on some of the the leading edge companies who are trying to contribute to this space and bring them into the government ecosystem. Bob Martin is with MITRE, the essential FFRDC, and where he is senior software and supply chain assurance principal engineer. Trey Ford is chief strategy and trust officer with BugCrowd. And Jay Gazle, and Jay, I'm sorry, am I getting your last name correct?
You did a great job.
Okay.
Great job.
All right. And last night I introduced Dr. Gautam, so I feel like I'm on a roll here. So
This is good at this.
and he is with CISA as the Deputy Associate Director for Vulnerability Management. And thank you all for being here. And for those, Brittany and Michaela, if we can find Anand, that would be, there we go, excellent. We will get this started in just a moment, but we really appreciate your participation. Very good. Anand, the panel is yours.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
All right. Yeah. So why don't we just talk about some of the new things with the development practices with AI, right? So the vibe coding side of the world, Katie, probably you can take a stab at this, and then we can have the MITRE talk about that.
Yeah, sure. So if everyone knows what vibe coding is, I'm not sure, but very cool term. Vibe coding is basically using AI assistance in order to build applications. And there is evidence that there's lots and lots and lots of AI assisted coding now. There's a lot of tools for generating software using AI. I think what we're going to do on this panel is talk a lot about what some of the security risks and mitigations are for code that is AI generated. So that's just going to kind of kick us off.
Well, in fact, one of the big problems is, where did AI learn to code? It looked at all the code that was out there. And how good is that code? Well, we know it's got a lot of problems. So guess what? The code AI makes has a lot of problems. You got to treat it as a junior introductory programmer. You got to manage it, you got to test it, you got to review it, and you're probably going to have to change it a lot.
We've got a lot of code on the internet, and it's not great. It's very pointedly not great. So we've got folks that are starting to write code, develop code that don't actually understand the code they're writing. How many folks here are actively writing code now? Anybody? We have a couple. I haven't written meaningful code in 15 years, maybe longer. The idea of me writing code now and being responsible for that code is terrifying. When you think about what it takes to run an internet-facing service, some notion of a resilient, stable offering, it's kind of like bringing a puppy home. It never stops. It's always there. It's always making messes. And so the idea of a total ownership model, which is how a lot of modern web services are run, if there's something that happens, you get paged out and you're responsible for that. Okay, well, we're not in Star Trek. Computer, change the setting for, oh dear, how do I fix this? There's the first problem where our folks that are responsible for the code don't actually understand the code. They are not able to troubleshoot, to correct, to harden that code. Hopefully AI over time will help us fix that. The second problem that Bob did speak to is this notion of provenance. These models were trained on open source software, which means a lot of the code samples that are being fed into your source code repository are open source. You all familiar with GPL and all of the other open source licensing? You're putting code in that is protected by specific copyright language that says you may actually need to open source that repository or that project because it is now using code appropriated from other sources. So the provenance and the source of those code, like those bodies of code, may not actually be yours anymore. So when you're buying software, when you're acquiring software, or if you're acquiring a company, you need to have a sense of what you've bought and if the people selling it actually own it to sell it to you.
I'm going to take the two of your points and put them together. Bob brought up a great word, code review. Let's remember that code review, the reason you do it is because at the time that you're doing the review, the person who wrote it remembers what it's for and how it's worked, and therefore can fix it in a timely and useful fashion. It becomes an understandable piece of code that you can contextualize and come back and maybe patch later if there's a bug. Well, great, that's a known thing. We know how to solve some of these problems. Maybe they're different in AI, but there's other parts of our software development lifecycle that can help us as we use AI to move our speed through the strike zone. And I think that my panelists here will have a lot of great things to say about how we interleave those throughout the AI development process.
I'm going to say one more thing, too, which is I think there is a big distinction between this whole concept of vibe coding, which I think implies that the individual coding literally has no software engineering background and just, natural language speaks to GPT and builds out code. And I think that is potentially in the future. It's not really super realistic right now that the vast majority of AI-generated code is being developed by software engineers who have some understanding kind of the underlying structure and what is good code. And so I think a lot of the things we're going to be talking about today are probably most applicable when we're talking about kind of software engineers using AI assistance in building code.
Right. I mean, if you are trying to build in a language you haven't really become familiar with or an environment you're not really up on all the nuances, AI assistance to tell you exactly the framework and all the parameters, the structures, and how to set up the architecture, wonderful. I mean, that's stuff that would take you hours, if not days, to research and put together. So it's very appropriate use of it there.
I think of this a lot as, are you familiar with the term founder code? A lot of your startups are racing to develop a proof of concept, prove this is possible. Time to value is what they're measuring. They're trying to demonstrate to you, the buyer. I guess it's a little harder in the public sector, but in the private sector, we're going to have a joint development partnership. I'm going to build a capability. You ask for a feature, I'm going to crank the feature out. There's a big, massive chasm separating founder code and proof of concept capabilities to enterprise, resilient, scalable, reliable architecture. And so vibe code, this notion of I'm going to build a software package without ever touching a keyboard because I talk to my computer. It's kind of terrifying. So I think it's a great place to start, and it's going to make a lot of automation and a lot of quick submissions very accessible. And I think that's a virtuous thing. But I want to separate the virtues of we've done something and proven something and made it possible to I've built meaningful, durable code.
Well, in any code you get these days, you should be asking for a bill of material. You should do that so that you understand what open source is in there, what licenses are in there, and so you can track what kind of vulnerabilities. Well, it's the same thing with code that's had AI help. You want to know what models were used, what's the provenance of the models, what data sets did it train on. So the whole idea of an SBOM bridges into AI systems very smoothly.
We had a show of hands earlier. How many people are involved in government contracts in one way or another? Great. Public sector. Here we go. Let's demarcate the difference between using vibe coding for that first demo that allows you to see what maybe a performer and the way they're going to be delivering you the solution. Let's do more of that. Let's have more agile presentations that show the innovation of the private sector. Then let's go back to those contracting clauses that protect our risks. You know, there's a lot of great example clauses out there that multiple agencies are using that can help you not only leverage modern ways of procuring code and understanding innovation, but then also bringing it back to the safety critical nature of much of the code that's run here in the US government.
So just on that point, right, on the verification side of the, so where is from the procurement side, right, from the government point of view, where are we going with mandating watermarking for the AI pieces of the code, or finding out which kind of models were actually used to generate that AI code, right? So do you have any sense of where from a procurement point of view, where we are going with it, in addition to SBOM and AI bomb? Is there anything else where these pieces of the code were actually generated by AI, something that the vendors have to prove, right?
I'm going to continue to kind of
Yeah.
kind of foot stomp. There's a new, maybe you saw an FRN out there about the minimum elements for SBOM.
Yeah.
And we are still welcoming comments
Yeah.
from industry partners and other government agencies on what are the basic types of information that you need to not only be an innovative player in our federal ecosystem, but also manage federal risk. Comments are open until,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. It's just
That was
that.
great. That was great.
Yeah, just that one piece of just a comment on that one is code is quite superfluous, right? So the UI code, for example, could change on a day-to-day basis. So expecting an SBOM out of that would be kind of, probably you need something more fluid than SBOM, like a VEX document or something like that, right, where the watermarking is. So is there any thoughts on actually adding to that, like, okay, there is the SBOM, which is your basic software, but then there is the additional pieces, which is the AI pieces of the code, which could be more dynamic in nature, right?
Well, I think you got to remember, AI systems are still software.
Yeah,
So you need a software bill of material for that system, which happens to be leveraging AI. And there's some additional things you want to track when it's that kind of system, but you still want to know the same basic facts that an SBOM covers. So the idea that there's something, you know, it's not a piece of pixie dust. It's, you know, technology. It's pretty strange if you think about it, how it works. But it's today, at least most of the time, just completing your sentence. It doesn't really create something out of the blue. It's looking at what patterns has it seen in the past. And going back to the provenance, it's seen a lot of bad stories, and it wants to write another bad story for you. So you have to shape what kind of, you know, plot line you want. So whether it's AI technology implementing it or just somebody hand coding something, you want to understand where did the stuff come from, and then you want to associate with that attestations about what kind of testing was done, what kind of validation was done, maybe other things. So you need to link these together.
Well, I think it's going to be interesting because if you look at the private sector, it's remarkable how quickly these AI code assistants have been adopted. You know, there are some big companies where they're now saying like basically 80% of their code is being generated by AI, you know, with human intervention, with human, you know, review, et cetera. And you were questioning sort of like the federal side of things. And, you know, one thing I would put out is we need to make sure we're not going to, you know, sort of hold back software developers that are developing for government, for, you know, the public sector, because we're sort of afraid of some of these things, because it's, you know, again, we don't want to be kind of like the laggards here, the late adopters. And I'm going to put something out there. I'm sure you guys will disagree with me, so this will be interesting. At the end of the day, AI-generated code is just code, whether it was generated by a person or AI.
Were you looking at my notes?
Yeah, no. And, you know, and so a lot of the same protections in terms of code reviews and, SAST and SCA and things like that will also be applicable here.
Right.
So,
It's
Yeah.
not, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, that's the kind of attestations I was speaking of.
I was going to make the really terrible reference that it's not a cereal box. I mean, an SBOM is not like the nutritional facts on the side of every box you see at the grocery store. It's not like a point in time, this is how we put it together, this is what's in there. I don't think vibe coding is meant to tie to vibrancy, but software evolves. It's a puppy. You're doing all these things, you're training it, you're feeding it. Like you can take a look at someone's children or their dogs to get a general sense of what their house feels like when you go to visit. What's happening in the behavior of the software? Not only what packages are included inside of that bill of materials, but what was used to build it. But then there's trailing artifacts. I mean, how many of us still rely on a point-in-time pen test and feel good about how that looks, knowing that there's 364 more days in the year that the code is changing and it's under attack? We've got to think about how to create this. I mean, I'm old enough to remember RSS feeds, but there's a continuous feed, and these things need to be subscribable and consumable, and you're looking to understand, wow, this package has been compromised. I've got all these vendors that are using this. How are we able to answer that? Not only that, wow, this was trained on this model using this RAG data sourced from these open source repositories. How does that impact the code that was developed, and what patterns, systemic or endemic, are we going to be worried about? And so when we think about this, I want to think about this in a continuous manner of not just did we get the bill of materials, but how is that evolving and how does that affect our attack surface?
Yeah, and for those of you who I think is all of you who are here for Dave's talk, when he said very clearly that the 3-year ATO cycle ain't gonna work, I would like to know how we can form a 3-year ATO cycle into kind of almost living and moving code and applications that is the reality of AI and SaaS and IaaS and PaaS, right? So like I would put a challenge out to anybody who's working at an agency or in the authorization space. How do you start looking about the way that you thoughtfully manage the risk in a more time-sensitive manner? Because he's spot on.
If you think about it, it's the same with personal health, right? You go to the doctor every once in a while. Now you have a health sensor on your wrist to tell you about blood pressure and loud noises, and you got to do that for your systems. You got to keep assessing them, keep aware of the changes in their behavior and constitution.
So is there any standards on the, let's say, the continuous assessment side of the world, right, that Bob, you were talking about? So is there any standards that we want to bring up about watermarking, right? Is watermarking of AI code generated, which is the output, is that good enough, or should we be watermarking even the prompts that went into that, and then the time and the models that actually were used, right? So those are all the factors that actually help review what kind of code was generated and then do some sort of a continuous assessment at a later point, right?
Well, the other way to do that is instrument your development environment so that you can know where it's interacting. I'm not sure watermarking constitution.
So is there any standards on the, let's say, the continuous assessment side of the world, right, that Bob, you were talking about? So is there any standards that we want to bring up about watermarking, right? Is watermarking of AI code generated, which is the output, is that good enough, or should we be watermarking even the prompts that went into that, and then the time and the models that actually were used, right? So those are all the factors that actually help review what kind of code was generated and then do some sort of a continuous assessment at a later point, right?
Well, the other way to do that is instrument your development environment so that you can know where it's interacting. I'm not sure watermarking is really going to tell you the right kinds of insights. But
It may not tell you at that point, but at a later point of time when you're a bit more aware.
well, definitely want to know where things come from. You know, what was the source of this piece of the system? So that's, I think the jury's still out on to exactly which techniques and approaches are going to be appropriate. It'll probably depend on which language systems you're using. But the idea is the provenance, understanding what's in your system.
In an incident response scenario, we often go back to a pull request to figure out what was done, who peer reviewed it, what got injected at what point. We start pulling that apart. And so when I start with the end in mind, if I can reference really bad business school books, what are we looking to surface and what are we looking to bring forward to us, the consumer of the software production process? I don't necessarily need to know that Trey or Ryan or Joe or Jenny wrote this piece of code, but I do want to know, okay, from a private equity standpoint, which parts of this code base were written by a human and which were generated? What's the provenance and do I have exposure there? Can we do a scan to make sure we haven't accidentally open sourced our intellectual property and our core innovation? But simultaneously, what are the odds of, I mean, you think about Cursor and you guys remember the auto run INF where you'd have like evil things put on like a drive or a disk, like it would take over your machine. This happened to Cursor this last week, like in the trailing 7 days. I would like to know what development environment, what variables, those sorts of things from a forensic artifact standpoint internally to know what my developers were doing, how they were using, which models they were plugged into. I don't know that I necessarily care what the prompt was, but what I do care about is what was coming out. I want the who, what, where, when, why, how components of that pull request. And I don't think that's going to be terribly hard to add.
Well, and the other thing is you need to know how these things are deployed.
Yes.
You know, you can have something that's totally correctly, securely, safely, resiliently built, designed, and it's deployed, and somebody changes a configuration somewhere, and you're owned.
Accidentally it all the way.
So let's just move on to the legal and the policy gaps a little bit over here. So AI-generated code is there, coming from all over the place. Is there any changes to the export control laws that is going to, that should be done in order to actually control where the AI code is actually coming from or where it is going? So is that something that should be thought about from a legal and a policy framework point of view?
I think this was Bob's grenade.
Bob?
I think,
I'm not going to comment on what the legal and policy implications are. I will say that training data is like hiring an employee,
Yes.
right? Your training data is another employee in your shop. So think about where your training data is coming from as you use AI to help make your business great. And
Yeah.
that might have some wobble there, but
Yeah.
I don't work for BIS.
yeah, I mean, the whole idea that you would bring in capabilities that you would never let in your front door if they were physically there, but they're becoming the heart and blood of your systems, it just doesn't make sense. So really being aware of not the models, the training data, even the open source components, just being aware where they're coming from and understand the risk at least. You can make a decision, but if you're making the decision not to look, that's a decision that,
Willful ignorance doesn't count.
So Katie, from a startup point of view, so what are the key advices you have for folks who are actually tilting too much towards the AI side of the world? So is there any pieces of advice that you want to give to the startups, right?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a couple of places where AI is really kind of coming into the startup community, and both in terms of companies that are using AI to build their systems, as well as those who are building security, both security for AI systems as well as security for using AI for kind of security operations, et cetera. I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity right now. So that's what I will say. I feel like we're kind of at this inflection point with AI generally, where those of us who are old enough to have lived through kind of the beginning of the internet and the beginning of mobile and the beginning of cloud, I feel like we're very much at kind of the same inflection point right now, and we're in the very early innings. So I think from a startup perspective, there's just a tremendous amount of opportunity when it comes to really reinventing a lot of systems using LLMs, using AI. From the standpoint of like actually securing your code that has been generated with AI, I think there are a lot of best practices out there, and more and more kind of coming out every day, really. Again, we're sort of in the very early innings here in terms of the types of prompting that you can use to build security into the code, because, to Bob's point, it's been trained on insecure code, so it's not going to just, potentially naturally do that. And then again, back to sort of the attestation and the tools that you can use to show security. But I think, from the standpoint of, my job really is talking to startups, and I will say that security for AI is a very, very hot area right now, right? And so there's a lot of companies that are thinking about this, that are building out security systems. It's always one of those interesting things because it's, again, kind of like cloud or even mobile, where it's very possible for the platform provider to just sort of build these kind of things into the platform at some point. And so, the companies that are building on top of the platforms, it's hard to know whether that capability will get subsumed into the platform itself, or whether there will be kind of continuing opportunities to build new companies around security for AI.
Well, and the whole idea about the security is, well, secure against what? And so most people make use of MITRE's ATT&CK framework for their traditional systems, and there's a system called Atlas, which is ATT&CK for AI. So the idea of understanding what could be going on, there's resources, global work to keep it evolving, but it's not something you have to sit late at night scratching your head. There's things to borrow and leverage.
So I'll ask for any questions from the audience, but meanwhile, people need to come and ask the questions over there. But one more aspect that I do want to ask the panel about is, we focused a lot on vibe coding, which is essentially humans actually interacting with AI to generate a piece of code. What about the other way around, where AI is continuously monitoring your entire code base, which is mostly not touched for every single release, and then it is summoning humans to address some of the issues in the code base, right? So where do you see that portion of the AI world going, right? Is that something that you guys have thought about?
I was going to say, AI is good at big data. And so if you can train it appropriately how to review code, how to look for changes that aren't approved, or whatever kind of monitoring, those are things humans are really bad at noticing. So those are very appropriate approaches to leveraging certain kinds of AI technology.
AI is really great at toil reduction. If it's boring, if you need to be well caffeinated, well rested, and focused, you don't need a meal, you don't need a bathroom break, like AI is going to be great for this. Where AI is going to fall down is when we start thinking about diversity of perspective, ingenuity, creativity. This is where we're going to need to augment and partner and be thoughtful. How do we make this fail? What are the odd failure modes? If you can create a simple pattern for it, that's great, but software is non-deterministic in a lot of behaviors. It's going to fail funny. You're often going to hear from users. You're also going to need a lot more innovative testing, not only in QA, but offensively.
I would just say this is where the private-public partnership and industry being transparent about how things are failing is really helpful to all of us, because as a cyber defense team here between the US government and industry, when we talk about how things fail, we can learn from each other and understand how to avoid those failures in our space. So that transparency is what's going to help us learn as we all innovate together.
Well, I'll leave you with one additional thought, which is, if you kind of flip that around, I think AI is going to be amazing at finding the flaws and vulnerabilities, et cetera, in code that has been generated. Adversaries can also use AI to find the flaws and vulnerabilities in code that is generated. And I think that's something we are already seeing, is the use of LLMs in kind of like malicious ways to find 0 days, find vulnerabilities that then can be exploited. So a flip side of that.
Yeah. So finally, yeah, AI is here to stay, whether we like it or not. So adopting
it.
Yeah, we should. Adopting it, we have to be a bit more careful, and putting the governance both on the usage and generation of AI models is extremely important. Thanks a lot, everyone, for joining this particular panel, and hope you have a good rest of the session.
All right, well, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.